It's time to take a look at the final Legacy of the Worthless archetype that'll appear on this series, and that is the Vehicroid archetype, which was a GX era archetype used by the main tritagonist of GX, Sho Marufuji. And what's this archetype's playstyle? Yeah, I can't exactly say for sure what it could be, because it didn't have one when it was featured in Legacy of the Worthless, because their monsters have a bunch of random underwhelming effects which are not useful like ever in the grand scheme of things. Although the newest wave of support actually tried their hardest to actually give them some sort of playstyle. So let's see what they are capable of now, and if they're capable of it at all. First of which we start off with a level 3 vanilla monster, CYCROID, which is a level 3 earth monster with 800 attack and 1000 defense, and has, like I said, as a vanilla monster, has no additional effects, and it's not worth discussing further. So let's just move on to our first actual effect monster, the level 2 DECOYROID. It's a wind level 2 with 300 attack and 500 defense, and when this face-up card is on your side of the field, your opponent cannot select a face-up monster as an attack target except DECOYROID. Okay, so this one is not great, because first of all is their weakest monster out of the bunch, and has a very bizarre level of level 2 because gimmicks. And yeah, it's an archetypal monster that modifies attack targets, although it's a pretty bad one at that, since if you control 2 of them, your opponents can still select which one to attack, since it does not say except this one instead of except DECOYROID. So yeah, we don't have a solar flare dragon here, and yeah, it's not worth running at all. Next up we have GYROID, which is another wind monster. This one with 1000 attack and defense. It's a level 3 monster, our first level 3, and once per turn this card cannot be destroyed by battle. And this is again very fine for at least the time period this card comes from, because yeah, this comes from a way slower format where a bunch of field presence wasn't basically a selling factor and a commonality. So setting a GYROID on your first turn ensure that you'll have some tribute fodder ready on your next turn, and then yeah, this was basically the most tolerable play you could ever make with this card. However, Marshmelon is an objectively better choice when it comes to monsters like this, so GYROID is immediately discredited for what he actually does. Next up we have AMBULANCEROID, which is a level 3 with 300 attack and 1200 defense, which are actually very horrible stats. And when a Roid monster is added from your graveyard to your hand, you can special summon that monster. And yeah, this card sets the precedency of the naming convention of the Vehicroid archetype, just adding the word Roid at the end of other vehicle related names in order to make an archetype. But this also made a certain other archetype searchable and interactable with this archetype, which will be evident within the new support. And of course I'm talking about SPEADROIDs, which I reviewed ages and ages ago, but still it's one of my better videos. So anyway, this is an effect that would be absolutely perfect for something that would be an archetype that's focused on fetching stuff from the graveyard back into the hand, or fetching from the graveyard in general. But this archetype is not focused on that, because there are only like 2 or 3 cards that do this. And yeah, it's really it combos with like 1 other card, and that's pretty much it. So yeah, other than like other than their one of their fusion monsters requiring it, and that said monster is material in order to actually provide a very somewhat decent monster, it's really not worth much. Next up we have DRILLROID, which is our first level 4. Before damage calculation, if this card attacks at a defense position monster, destroy that monster. Among the numerous monsters which focus on instantly blowing up defense position monsters, DRILLROID is actually the best among them because he's the only one who's not limited to face down defense position monsters, which made him relevant for like one format where flip effect monsters were where defense position and flip effect monsters were basically all the rage. But nowadays he ain't gonna do much unless it's against a super heavy samurai or an exiled player, so this one's not worth discussing further. Next up we have JETROID, which is another level 4, and he has the effect that at the time this card is selected as an attack target by an opponent's monster, you can activate trap cards from your hand. This one has at least a neat idea behind it, but yeah, the fact that this thing has this effect and the opponent can like easily see it, it basically instantly says that that you do actually have some trap cards in your hand that you are ready to activate on your opponent's face if you actually decide to attack into this. Although you are limited to very underwhelming battle traps if you are actually deciding to play this, so yeah, it's not worth it. Next up we have CARRIERROID. This is a level 4 with 1000 attack and 800 defense. And when your opponent activates a card's effect that targets and destroys a spell or trap you control, you can discard one card to negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. Okay, this one at least has certain practicalities if he's being played in an archetype or a deck that heavily relies on its back row to function, such as pendulum decks. But again, it's a level 4 with very pathetic stats, which is barely searchable, and yeah, it's pretty meh overall. Although the negation effect is actually not once per turn, so I will give it credit at least for that, even though it's still not worth running. Next up we have PATROID, which is another level 4. And once per turn during your main phase, you can look at one face down card your opponent controls, then return it to its original position. Okay, so it's kind of bizarrely terrible, aside from like knowing what the opponent might be hiding beneath their face down cards, which most likely are going to be back row pieces. And it's essentially pointless since you will most likely want to destroy those cards immediately, as in destroy them with stuff like MST or Twin Twisters, instead of just looking at them and knowing when not to attack or something. So yeah, PATROID is very underwhelming. Next up we have STEALTHROID, which is yet another level 4. Yeah, this archetype is filled with level 4 machines. And this one has the effect that if this card attacks, destroy one spell or trap at the end of the battle phase if you control another Roid monster. I really don't understand these cards that focus on popping back row after battle. It's like one of the most GX things you can ever see on a card, next to like minuscule burn damage or burn cards that are in archetypes that have nothing to do with burn damage in the slightest. So yeah, and again, this thing specifically needs to be attacking, and you need to control another Roid monster in order to pull off the destruction effect, which is basically very bad card design, and you shouldn't ever consider running this. Next up we have STEAMROID. Now this one is actually kind of decent. If this card attacks an opponent's monster, this card gains 500 attack during the damage step only, and if this card is attacked by an opponent's monster, this card loses 500 attack during the damage step only. Now I could have seen this being used on a locals level to get rid of some problematic tribute monsters back in the day, because if this thing attacks a monster, it becomes a 2300 attack beatstick, which is actually a pretty decent attack value for a level 4, especially back in the day. But if it gets attacked, it becomes a very underwhelming level 4 beatstick, which is certainly not a quality, but still, I guess you can consider running it because it's one of their the Archetype's better beat sticks overall. Yeah, it's basically what you run out of obligation, if anything. Next up we have SUBMARINEROID, which is another level 4. And this card can attack your opponent directly, but when this card does so using this effect, the battle damage is inflicted to your opponent is equal to the original attack of this card. At the end of the damage step, if this card attacked or was attacked, you can change this card to phase up defense position. Yeah, it's essentially built for an archetype that revolves around dealing damage to the opponent by any means necessary. Which droids are certainly not, as like they don't even have any cards to basically take advantage of this card's effect. But essentially, this card is basically your one-out option to basically anything ever that the archetype can't run over. So yeah, you basically run this in order to poke the opponent for 800 each time this card attacks, and then switch it back to defense mode because you really need to defend yourself. And besides this thing being a staple in stuff like TAC Force 1, it's not worth looking at any further than now. Next up we have TRUCKROID, which is another level 4, when this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, equip the destroyed monster to this card, and this card gains attack equal to the combined attack of the monsters equipped to it by its effect. Honestly, this is among one of their better level 4s by far, because again, if you prop him up with like an equip spell that can boost his attack by at least 5 to 800, he'll be able to run over some average level 4s in the game, and thus it'll be boosted to around 2500 attack, which is actually a pretty good attack value, and then he can proceed to beat over bigger stuff. But again, this is a very inconsistent beatdown strategy, so yeah. But again, it is one of their better level 4 monsters, since it also has 2000 defense, meaning it can be used as a very decent wall, so yeah. Next up we have SHUTTLEROID. When this card is targeted for an attack, you can banish this card and during your next standby phase, special summon this card banished by this effect, and if summoned this way, inflict 1000 damage to your opponent. Yeah, it's essentially a very inconsistent prototype chain beat and nothing else, basically. Yeah, it's essentially, this is another card which, unlike the likes of what was it called, Wind Up Rabbit. Yeah, that's right. The cards you basically build your entire decks around, such as like chain beat, but yeah, it's essentially only that and nothing more. And I need to point out that SHUTTLEROID is actually a very, very old OCG exclusive. Yeah, he came out in 2005, I believe. Yeah, I think he came out in 2005, and thus he is a 15-year-old OCG exclusive. And yeah, will he be ever adapted into the TCG? I do not know, but if he does not, nobody will ever miss him, since he was only used in the manga and never seen again. Next up we have MYXEROID, which is one of their newer pieces of support. Has 0 attack and 2200 defense, and you contribute 1 machine monster to special summon a non-win Roid monster from your deck. And you can pay half your life points to banish any number of machine monsters from your graveyard, including this card, to special summon from your extra deck a Roid fusion monster with the same level as the number of those banished monsters, ignoring its summoning conditions, but destroy it during the end phase. And you can only use this effect once per turn. And you can only use each effect once per turn. Okay, so now we get a glimpse that the archetype actually is focused on fusion spamming as well. And now for the first effect. First effect basically disables you from summoning other wind monsters in the archetype, such as DECOYROID, GYROID, JETROID, and SHUTTLEROID, and additional copies of itself, which was only put here onto this effect as a way to exclude SPEEDROIDs from the arsenal. because yeah, this is a Vehicroid support card that came a good 10 years after the actual last piece of Vehicroid support from the anime did. So yeah, that's that, and not to mention this thing is actually a machine dupe target due to its lower attack values, so which is something they definitely had in mind when designing this effect. So yeah, you can basically go from 1 monsters to 3 with a simple machine dupe. However, the second effect is something I would almost consider good, but the fact that it blows up the monster during the end phase is not even the worst thing about the card. Is not even the worst thing about the card. It's the fact that you need to banish exact and the monsters whose exact levels are like the monsters whose combined levels. I'm getting very mixed up. You need to banish a number of monsters up to the number of the level of the monster you're summoning. Meaning, if you're summoning a level 5 monster, you need to banish 5 monsters. And if you're summoning a level 12 monsters, you'll need to banish 12 monsters, which is a very costly thing to do. So yeah, the only question I'm gonna ask with this is, what are you going to summon with this, and are you gonna make it worth the trouble, since the monster is going to be blown up during the end phase? So yeah, I guess it's worth running at 3, even though the second effect will barely ever be used. Eh? Anyway, next up we have our final level 4, which is EXPRESSROID. EXPRESSROID has the effect that when this card is summoned in any way possible, you can target 2 Roid monsters in your graveyard and add them to your hand, and you cannot target EXPRESSROID with this effect. And honestly, this is actually a very neat form of graveyard recycling, as in if you have AMBULANCEROID on the field, you can actually go from 1 monsters to 4 within a single normal summon. Although this play is actually very specific and requires some additional setup. But yeah, this is honestly the best main deck Roid monster. And yeah, the only bad thing I can say about this card is that it has very low attack values, meaning if you don't use it for an XC summon or Link summon, it's probably going to get run over by something much bigger than it, and you're going to be taking a hot chock full of damage. Now we move on to their level 6, first level 6, the UFOROID. It's a level 6 with 1200 attack and defense, and when this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon 1 machine type monster with 1500 or less attack from your deck in face up attack position. And honestly, yeah, this is actually the typal machine searcher for machine type monsters such as Masked Dragon, Unmasked Dragon, Howling Insect, Pyramid Turtle. And yeah, UFOROID does the exact same thing as machines, and it's barely even a Roid card when we're comparing it to all those monsters. But the advantage those monsters have over this thing is that they are not tribute monsters for whatever reason. If this was like 2 levels lower, then I would have called it an amazing card and a 3-off staple in Roids, but it's not, so yeah, it's very bad and very not worth running. Even though it actually has a fusion monster which requires it as material, but we'll get to that soon. Next up we have RESCUEROID, which is a level 6 with yet more pathetic stats of 1600 attack and 1800 defense. And when a Roid monster you control is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can return that monster to its owner's hand. And yeah, this combined with AMBULANCEROID can actually perform a very slow and mediocre loop involving DECOYROID, honestly enough. Which goes along the lines of this, because when a DECOYROID is on the field, and it's the only monster on the field, it's the only monster that the opponent can attack. Then the opponent rams into DECOYROID, RESCUEROID pulls it back into the hand, and AMBULANCEROID resummons it, and you basically have an impenetrable wall when it comes to your field presence. And if you happen to have a cards such as Cyber Summon Blaster, you can basically poke the opponent for 300 damage each time DECOYROID comes back. So yeah, it's a very slow and inconsistent loop, so yeah, this one's not worth discussing much further. And their final main deck monster is the level 8 ARMOROID. If this card is tribute summoned by tributing at least one Roid monster, banish all spell and traps on the field. Honestly, this is actually a very solid boss monster, at least for the main deck, as in it actually triggers upon tributing stuff like Terror Tarp and Taketomborg, which actually are worth running in the deck just because of this thing, and because the removal effect this thing offers is quite powerful, and it's the biggest main deck beatstick of the archetype. So yeah, it's definitely worth running, even though it also is a level 8 monster which you can use for trade-in, so that's actually some other levels of consistency here, which is actually pretty neat. Alright, now let's move on to their fusion monsters, first of which we have CYCROID. It requires 2 machine type monsters with the same name, and its only effect is that it can attack your opponent directly. Honestly, this is actually a staple in many machine-based decks focused on fusion summoning, namely Cyber Dragons, as in when it's summoned with Power Bond, it basically becomes a 3200 attack direct attacker, which is certainly nothing to scoff at. And it's also a level 5 monster, meaning it can bring out, it can be brought out with instant fusion, and thus be treated as one of the Xyz materials for Cyber Dragon Nova, which you can then proceed to rank up into infinity. So yeah, this is basically the archetype's equivalent of Cowboy for game, and the Cyber Dragons I find it a lot more useful. But yeah, beggars really can be choosers here. And also, its anime summoning condition was actually 2 CYCROIDs instead of 2 machine monsters with the same name. And I'm very glad they kept the summoning condition out of the real game, because this segment of the video would be spoken in an entirely different tone if it was like that. Now for their level 6 monsters, first of which we have STEAMROID, which requires GYROID and STEAMROID as its material, and it's a vanilla monster that has no additional effects, so let's just move on. Next up we have their final level 6, AMBULANCEROID. This one requires RESCUEROID and AMBULANCEROID as material, and this card cannot be special summoned except by fusion summon, and once per turn when a monster on your side of the field is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can special that monster in defense position. Essentially, they merged the effect of AMBULANCEROID and RESCUEROID and gave it a soft once per turn, as it was probably for the best, because if it actually had the merged effects of AMBULANCEROID and RESCUEROID, it could have been abused for other infinite loop shenanigans. But thankfully, due to the existence of this, if you would actually want to construct the loop I mentioned earlier with AMBULANCEROID and RESCUEROID, you can basically fusion summon this, then use defusion to basically resummon the materials back from the graveyard, and then you have very quick and easy access to the loop. And also, then you find some way to get out DECOYROID onto the field in defense position, and then the loop is basically constructed. So yeah, it's one of the better plays the archetype can make, in my opinion. And now we move on to their level 8 monster, their only level 8 monster, that being Super Vehicroid Jumbo Drill. It's a level 8 with 3000 attack and 2000 defense, and requires STEAMROID, DRILLROID, and SUBMARINEROID as material. And the fusion summon of this card can only be conducted with the above fusion materials, and its only other effect is that it deals piercing damage. Honestly, again, this card saw a lot more play in Cyber Dragons due to the fact that Cyber Dragon Nova can float into it. And if you couldn't afford to bring out Cyber Dragon, Jumbo Drill was a decent second choice, if anything, because it was a 3000 attack beatstick which could inflict piercing damage. So, yeah, that's about it. That's about it when it comes to the relevant utility of this thing. Next up we have their only level 9 monster, Super Vehicroid Stealth Union. This one requires TRUCKROID, EXPRESSROID, DRILLROID, and STEALTHROID, and has 3600 attack and 3000 defense. And once per turn, you can target one face-up non-machine monster on the field, equip that target to this card, and while equipped to with a monster by this effect, this card can attack all monsters your opponent controls once each. If this card attacks, its original attack is halved, and if this card attacks a defense position monster, inflicts piercing damage. I mean, this could have been an amazing boss monster considering the effort you need to bring this thing out. And funnily enough, this is actually, I think, the only fusion monster in the entire game which requires at least 4 specific fusion materials. And yeah, I think this is literally the only monster with with those kind of stipulations. And considering the fact that only one of those is actually worth running, actually 2 if we include TRUCKROID, that's a very inherent -4 or -5 just to bring this thing out. And it has the audacity, yeah, if it only didn't have the effect where its attack is halved during the damage step, I would have called it a pretty good card, no question about it. And not to mention, this is also supposed to be a GYROID reference, as you can see by the monster's design. And it's not a very good monster, so yeah, it's a crying shame that it ended up being like this. So yeah, this one is not worth discussing further. Next up we have their newest fusion monster, which is the level 10 Super Vehicroid mobile base. This one requires a Roid fusion monster, and any Roid monster as material, has 0 attack and 5000 defense. And you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls and special summon a Roid monster from your deck or extra deck with attack less than or equal to that monster, and you can only use this effect of a Super Vehicroid mobile base once per turn. Once per turn during the end phase, you can target a Roid monster in your main monster zone other than this card. Return that monster you control to the hand, and if you do, move that card you control to that monster's monster zone. Yeah, you can smell, especially with the last effect, that this basically came during the prime of Master Roll 4, where saving up your extra monster zone was a task of its own. And it's pretty bizarre considering the fact that you have to bounce back a Roid you control into your hand in order to move it. But the most interesting thing about this thing is absolutely the first effect. First of all, yeah, it requires the opponent to actually control some decent shit. But the fact that this thing has 0 attack is actually very important, because this thing can actually bring another copy of itself back from the extra deck, and it'll allow you to go into a rank 10 monster, which is most likely going to be number 81 Super Dora or Gustav Max if you are somehow in the late game and you want to burn the opponent for the final 2000 damage. And yeah, it's a very interesting effect, but it also works on STEAMROIDs, which is also pretty interesting, meaning you can bring out the STEAMROID synchro monsters from the extra deck, such as High STEAMROID Kite Drake, which is actually a very formidable beatstick to bring out with this thing. So yeah, this is a very peculiar card, and combined with the fact that you can easily summon it by simply using instant fusion and bringing out pair CYCROID and just having another Roid monster with a fusion card in your hand is the cherry on top on how you can very easily summon this thing. This is a definite boss monster of the archetype, one of said definite boss monsters if you decide to play it and if you can actually bring it out. Next up we have their final level 10, which is UFOROID Fighter. It requires UFOROID as material, and any warrior type monster has undetermined attack and defense. And a fusion summon of this card can only be conducted with the above fusion materials. And its only other effect is that the original attack and defense of this card become equal to the combined original attack of the 2 fusion monsters used for its fusion summon. Yeah, essentially, since you don't decide to run UFOROID, most of the time you basically have to build your entire decks around this card, since this thing can only be a big stupid beatstick and nothing else. And also it's basically anime garbage, which was used in like one episode of JX and was used to basically fuse UFOROID with Elemental Hero Tempest, which is another very shitty card that nobody uses. So yeah, don't bother with this one. And their final monster, thank God, we have Barboroid, the Ultimate Battle Machine, which is a monster only appearing in the manga. It's a big level 12 with the 4000 attack and defense, and requires 5 machine-type Roid monsters. And this card can make a second attack during each battle phase, and this card cannot attack your opponent directly. After damage calculation, if this card attacked an opponent's monster, negate the effects of that monster including in the graveyard, and if this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, inflict 1000 damage to your opponent. So yeah, as far as boss monsters go, this is actually a very formidable one. It's such a shame that the Roids have barely any capital involved in order to actually summon this thing consistently, because if they did, they would actually be somewhat good, especially for the time they can come from, but they're not. So yeah, it's pretty much not worth discussing further, although this card actually does see a fair amount of play in Cosmos and Cyber Dragons, due to the fact that it does not specifically need to be fusion summoned in order to actually hit the field, as in cards like Cyber Dragon Nova and some of the Cosmo cards can actually float into this thing. So yeah, directly from the extra deck. So yeah, it's a very good card to bring out in archetypes that are not Roid archetypes, because it's simply too hard for them to summon, because rounding up 5 machine type Roid monsters is simply a monumental task for this archetype. Although, if you actually decide to play this in Speedroids, you can actually somewhat fairly easily make this thing happen in Roids, because rounding up 5 of them on the field is actually not too hard, but it can occasionally cause problems. So yeah, run it in Speedroids if you want to somewhat experiment with the card. Alright, now for their back row, which is not going to be as long as the monster lineup. First of which we have their field spell Megaroid City, which is another one of their newer pieces of support. You can target one other card you control, destroy it, and if you do, add 1 Roid card from your deck to your hand, and during damage calculation, if your Roid monster if your Roid monster battles, you can send 1 Roid monster from your deck to the graveyard and switch the original attack and defense of your battling monster, except during the damage calculation only. You can only use each effect once per turn, and you cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck except fusion monsters the turn you activate this effect. And you activate either of this card and its effects even if this card leaves the field. I have no idea what happened there, got mixed up there, but anyway, this is actually a very good card, no question about it. And its most intended usage was to basically make mobile base into a 5000 attack beat stick after you bring it out properly. And the searching effect is actually basically the only way in the archetype that the archetype can plus, because it can basically search out any Roid card from your deck to your hand, which includes all of the monster lineup, all of their spell cards, and most of their traps. It only does not search out one specific trap card, which we'll get to later. So yeah, it basically needed to be this good in order to actually allow the archetype to actually see play. And you basically have to run 3 of these out of obligation and not out of personal choice. Next up we have their final spell card, Vehicroid Connection Zone. It allows you to fusion summon a Vehicroid fusion monster from your extra deck, meaning only Jumbo Drill, Stealth, Union, and Mobile Base. Using the monster from your extra deck, using monsters from your hand or field as fusion materials, and if you do, it cannot be destroyed by card effects and its effects cannot be negated. Again, only Jumbo Drill and Mobile Base are worth running, and Mobile Base can be summoned a bit easier. Yeah, Mobile Base is actually the best target to actually use this effect on, because yeah, it can actually turn the tide of the duel around if you use it correctly. But then again, it's an unsearchable fusion spell, because it does not have any fusion words in the name. So yeah, it's basically, yeah, the only way you can actually search it is via the field spell, and the field spell actually requires to blow up something on the field, which is not the most consistent strategy most of the time. Now moving on to their trap cards, first of which we have Supercharge. When your opponent declares an attack while the only monsters you control are machine type Roid monsters, draw 2 cards. Yeah, and drawing 2 cards is always nice, but the bizarre way of triggering it is not that bad, because it's one of the only ways the archetype can plus, if we exclude of course the field spell, so you might as well treat yourself to 3 of these. Next up we have Wonder Garage. When this face down card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon 1 level 4 or lower machine type Roid monster from your hand. It's unsearchable, and it's very slow, and requires you to go -2 if you decide to spring it yourself, so not worth discussing further. And their final card is the Counter Trap EMERGEROID Call. When a spell, trap, or monster effect is activated while you control a Roid fusion monster, negate the activation, send all cards with the same name as that card from the activating player's deck and extra deck to the graveyard, and you can banish this card from your graveyard to target a Roid monster in your graveyard and add it to your hand, and you can only use this effect once per turn. Okay, so this negation effect, it's an archetype omni-negate of course, is actually fairly powerful, as it actually shuts down all additional copies of the card you negated for the rest of the duel. Somewhat, it just sends them to the graveyard. The opponent can actually recycle them, although if you actually manage to pull this kind of effect off, you'll probably win the game, which is ironic enough considering we're talking about Roids. However, this comes at a cost of controlling a Roid fusion monster, which in most cases I imagine is going to be either CYCROID or mobile base, because any other monsters are not going to be on the field for much longer. But the second effect is actually there, it's just there. It's not going to be going off a lot, a bit too often, but it actually does combo well with AMBULANCEROID if you decide to run him, so I guess the option's there if you want to take it. And we are finally done with Roids. We're getting into very long videos here because the archetypes I have left have a bajillion cards left. But anyway, let's go on with the grading scale. In terms of consistency, the only archetypal way to actually provide some additional consistency is Megaroid City and Supercharge, which are not that consistent in order to bump this to any further than a 1 out of 3. Their only power output is within a certain array of fusion monsters, power bond with CYCROID, mobile base with the field spell, and Barboroid if you actually manage to bring it out, and those are some very specific situations, which basically means they'll be getting a 1 out of 3 here as well. Comeback ability is completely non-existent. It basically actually relies on very specific setups with, revolving mostly EXPRESSROID and AMBULANCEROID being on the field, and again, it's a very specific thing to be considered a comeback ability, so it's not worth discussing further, and it's 1 out of 3 here as well. In terms of protection, well, CARRIERROID is the only form of protection the archetype has. So yeah, and the Vehicroid connection zone can basically protect the fusion monsters, only certain fusion monsters, mind you. Again, it's very specific, so it's a 1 out of 3. However, in terms of versatility, I gotta give a somewhat generous 2 out of 3, simply because EMERGEROID Call is actually a very powerful negation effect, and if you actually do manage to pull it off, I've seen some Cyber Dragon builds actually running this while having CYCROID or Jumbo Drill on the field, so yeah. It gets a 2 out of 3 simply because EMERGEROID Call exists in terms of versatility, but if it didn't, it would be again a very solid 1 out of 3 as well. It would be no better than its Legacy of the Worthless version that Rada reviewed. And we're finally done with this archetype. This turned out to be a one review and a half, as it would seem. I'm almost pushing 40 minutes, so let me just wrap things up here. This was the final legacy of the Worthless archetype, and yeah, we only have 3 more GX archetypes to go, but before that we'll be tackling the final Dual Monsters archetype that I'll be reviewing in this Rota Marathon, and the final Dual Monsters archetype that will appear on the series for a good while, until of course the Konami decides to adapt some of the anime exclusive archetypes into the game. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned for more videos and updates. Comment, like, and subscribe. Be sure to check out my Patreon when you got the time. Maybe drop a few donations if you feel like it. And I'll upload the next video whenever I can. And see you all and have a good day. Peace.